I had them all long before I dial up. How they claiming they on top and I'm a mile up. I had them all long before.
Hey everybody, it's Jacquie Luqman. Welcome to the second episode and I think the last episode in this particular conversation, Lessons from the Life of a Black Man, Part 2. This is the other part of the conversation that I know that Abdus wanted you to know, that he wanted to have. And I know that because he and I had these conversations together for years, at least the political part of the conversation that I'm going to get into tonight. And honestly, this is probably going to be the most difficult part of what I know that Abdus wanted to tell you. Because it involves a part of his life and a part of his struggle that it was very difficult for him to be public about because of all of the issues, well, some of the issues that I'm going to try to get through in this one. So Abdus, my husband, my late husband, Abdus Shaheed Luqman, did not understand that what he was suffering from was called co-concurrent disorders that are commonly seen together. And let me warn you, I'm going to be doing a lot of screen sharing tonight, y'all, because listen, I said I'm going to talk about the politics behind this and the science behind this. So I'm not going to sit here and give you my opinion. I am going to give you data. I'm going to give you information. I'm going to give you links, and I'm going to provide all of the links that I share with you in the description of this video after I edit it, after we're done. And I got a lot to go through, so let me stop, but okay, so Abdus was suffering from something that's called co-concurrent disorders. And that is a clinical medical term for what we used to call, what people used to call dual diagnosis. But, now it's called something else. But basically what it is this. Co-concurring disorders refers to having a coexisting mental illness and substance abuse disorder. And be clear that substance abuse, what we think of as addiction, is a disorder. It is a clinical medical disorder. So what Abdus didn't understand, number one, was that he suffered from bipolar disorder, which was only diagnosed, I said in the show last week that it was 3 years ago. But actually, when I checked, it was actually 2 years ago, just 2 years ago, that Abdus Shaheed was finally diagnosed with bipolar disorder and finally received medication for it. Just 2 years ago. He also suffered from substance abuse disorder. And that's where the shame and embarrassment and lack of trust comes in, where he wasn't sure if he was able to talk about this. But it is a disorder. Addiction, substance abuse is a clinical disorder. It's not a moral failing. It's not an indication of moral bankruptcy on individuals. It's not a lack of willpower among individuals. It is a medical disorder, and the medical community, the science community around the world recognize this. So a little bit more about co-concurring disorders here on Psychology Today. As you can see, this article comes from. I'm going to scroll down just a little bit because now I'm sure you have questions. The common co-occurring disorders, and they are a lot more common than we think they are. People with mental health disorders are more likely to have a substance abuse disorder than people who do not have either one of those. You understand what I'm saying? So roughly half of the individuals who have either a mental illness or a substance abuse disorder will have the other at some point in their lives. And this is according to the National Institute on Drug Abuse. I'm sure people are asking, well, which develops first, the addiction or the mental illness? There is no scientific consensus on this because, I mean, first of all, that's a dumb question. I feel like people ask that question because they still want to judge people because they're hoping that, the answer is, well, the addiction comes first and then the mental disorder comes after. So then all people have to do to avoid the mental disorder is to not, become an addict. It's not that simple. There are many pathways to co-occurring disorders. People with mental illness often turn to drugs or alcohol to self-medicate their anxiety, depression, or PTSD, which can then turn into addiction. For others, chronic substance abuse and the problems that follow may lead to depression, anxiety, or other conditions. Both disorders can exist without causing the other due to underlying genetic or environmental factors. Integrated treatment for substance abuse and bipolar disorder or co-concurring disorders involves coordinating substance abuse and mental health interventions rather than treating each disorder separately without consideration for the other, which is what happens all the time. Very frequently, probably almost in 80 to 90% of the cases of people who struggle with substance abuse, many of those people are never screened for a mental disorder. And at least half of those people do have a mental disorder that contributes to their persistent problems with the substance abuse disorder. So this integrated treatment often involves forms of behavioral treatment, dialectical behavioral therapy, in combination with medication, collaboration between clinicians, organizations that offer support, handling issues related to, look at this, housing, health, and work. Not only did Abdus not understand a lot about his bipolar disorder, he didn't even know that he had bipolar disorder until 2 years ago, but he also didn't understand the impact that bipolar disorder played on his addiction. And he, like I said, he was trying so hard to work through the guilt and the shame and the embarrassment and the, not wanting to be judged any longer, because he had been judged and condemned and treated like crap for as long as he has been dealing with, this, the addiction. He wasn't sure who he could trust, if he could trust putting this out there. So he really didn't understand all of these details, but honestly, neither did I. So I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I had all of these answers. I didn't. I learned all this. I learned a lot of this about the science part of it, the medical part of it, after he passed away. And I learned all of this information because my therapist told me to go look it up. When I told her, and I don't know why I didn't tell her before, but I told her, I said, I know that he was recently diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And she just stopped. It was in the middle of my session with her. She just stopped and she said, wait, what did you say? I said, yeah, but maybe 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, whenever it was, I couldn't get the timeline right. But I said, yeah, he was recently diagnosed with bipolar disorder and he was just starting to take medication for it, very, very recently. And she said, and she literally had her hands up like this, and she said, this explains everything. And I was like, what are you talking about? Because I'd been in therapy for a few years, and he had been in therapy for a few years, but he was never diagnosed. So these issues came up in my therapy. And I don't know why I just didn't tell her that he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. But she said, everything we've talked about your frustration at the relapses that didn't make sense and his frustration at the relapses that didn't make sense. She said, the bipolar disorder explains all of that. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, I'm not going to explain it to you. You are going to look it up. You're going to look up the science and you're going to understand why a disorder that was already so difficult for most people to overcome all by itself was made even more difficult by an undiagnosed mental disorder. So I did. And that's when I learned all this information about the science behind addiction. So that's why I really felt like I had to have this conversation, because this is incredibly important, because the medical realities that make addiction and the relapses that come with addiction, an actual mental health disorder, like I said, are not an individual failing. This information is the missing link to how all of us misunderstand addiction entirely. It's this science that we don't know, most of us, that has us believing that people suffering from addiction are just crackheads or junkies and drunks or meth heads. And it's this lack of knowledge of this science that makes it easy for people who don't suffer from addiction to judge and shame and condemn people who do. So it's this judgment and condemnation and his own feelings of shame at a disorder, like I said, he didn't completely understand himself, that made it difficult for Abdus to talk about this. But like I said, he was working up the courage. So here are some statistics that I hope will help people understand is a societal problem and not an individual problem. Roughly 9 million people suffered from both mental illness and substance abuse disorder. And I'm about to share this nice PowerPoint presentation. And let me go to slide 4. And so 9.5 million people in this country suffered from both mental illness and a substance abuse disorder. And this is according to the 2019 annual report by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And you can see in the graphic here that 19.3 million people, or 7.7% of the population of this country, suffered from only a substance abuse disorder. 51.5 million people suffered from a mental illness. But between the two of those groups, 9.5 million people suffer with both. All right. So this is very, very important information. So this is not like a problem that is an individualized issue. This is almost 10 million people. And this is 10 million people that honestly, this agency, I think, is underreporting because they do a survey, right? And I think they check medical records and like I said, there's a lot of shame and stigma attached to both of these disorders. So, I mean, people aren't really going to be real forthcoming about admitting that they struggle with these disorders because of the shame and the stigma. So I would even take these numbers with a grain of salt, but they are the official numbers. But like I said, I think they're actually underestimating this number. I want to talk about a little bit about how the scientific community explains the rise in substance abuse disorder. All right, because the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine released this report that I am about to share with you. And I'm going to scroll down because I couldn't highlight the part that I wanted to show you because it wouldn't let me. But the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, they are kind of a big deal in the science community in this country, released this report in March of this year that shows that drugs and alcohol are major contributors to the rise in working age mortality. From 1990 to 2017, fatal drug overdoses in working age Americans increased in every state. But increases were especially large in Appalachia, New England, and the industrial Midwest. And the committee described the overdose epidemic as, quote, a perfect storm created by a market flooded with highly addictive and deadly prescription and illicit drugs and mounting demand for substances to bring relief from physical, mental, and psychological pain. And the report also explores the rise in suicides, which was most dramatic for white men. And the increase in deaths, which began in the 1990s, occurred against the backdrop of major changes in American life, including disruptions in the U.S. economy that devastated families and communities, especially in areas like the Rust Belt and Appalachia, where working age death rates increased the most. And I hope you can read all that on the screen there because that's what it says. Now, it's funny that the National Academies called the opioid epidemic and the rise in suicides among white men a result of the perfect storm, because I am sure you have heard me and Abdus call the crack epidemic the perfect storm on many occasions. Why did we say that? What was the perfect storm for our communities that created the crack epidemic that so many of our people suffer from? Before I share this other piece with you, I want to bring your attention to this paragraph right before the one I just read for in this report that talks about mortality disparities. And they do talk about how death rates are higher and increasing faster, among working age adults with less education and income, that the report says that the death rates among Black working age adults have been disproportionately high for a long time due to inequalities in socioeconomic status, healthcare, housing, education, and other factors. And that reflects the legacy of structural racism. So when people tell you that they don't believe that racism contributes to the declining health and the higher death rates among Black people, yeah, that's not true. There is scientific data that scientists in this very country compile that prove that that's true. But they go on to say that although progress occurred at the turn of the century in reducing the mortality gap between Black and white Americans, it didn't reduce it that much. There was just a reduction. Death rates in working age Black people are now increasing, effectively erasing that progress. All right? Remember that, because that is very important in what we're going to talk about right now. And you know, Abdus and I talked about this frequently. SETA Jobs, Summer Jobs Program. And this is an article from the archives of a site called UPI. And I'm sorry, I was lazy, so I didn't even look up what UPI is. But this is absolutely true. This is an archive from 1981, an article from 1981. So this was the change. Brewski says hi, y'all. This was the change that affected our communities, that affected our families. One of them, President Reagan ended the Comprehensive Employment and Training Program, or the SETA program. Abdus and I talked about this all of the time. The SETA program that existed to train workers and provide them with jobs in the public service, right? The jobs were subsidized by the federal government. Interestingly enough, the SETA program was started by Richard Nixon, who signed the program into law in 1973. And the program offered jobs to low-income folks and the long-term unemployed, as well as summer jobs for poor kids. Me and Abdus had those summer jobs, right? Full-time jobs were provided for people for a period of up to 2 years in public agencies and private not-for-profit organizations to help people get skills to move to a permanent, unsubsidized job. And if it sounds familiar, it should. It was subsidized by, or it was inspired rather by the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA program from the 1930s. So in 1981, Ronald Reagan decides, fuck that, I'm gonna cut this program. So this is one of the things that was a part of the perfect storm that negatively impacted our families and our communities. All right. And of course, this was all done by Reagan, allegedly to save money. You can see here now that Reagan said that this ended the program would save like $800 million. And it's crazy when you look at the numbers, because I didn't even realize this, but there were 302,000 people that were employed in the SETA program. 302,000 people. And that cheap, hateful, racist bastard wouldn't even let those people have jobs. Okay, so you get what I'm saying. All right. So the SETA program being cut had impacts that rippled across our community. It wasn't just, summer jobs for kids that were gone. It was also any hope that hundreds of thousands of poor people and chronically unemployed people had that was taken away, that they would ever get any kind of job skills to transition to a decent job. But there is this great article from the New York Times archives. I told you, a lot of screen shares, a lot of information. That goes into detail about the dissolution of CETA by conservatives and how the argument about fraud and waste from them was used back then. But see, it was state governments that were using federal money to pay existing state employees rather than training and hiring new people. So all of this fraud and waste that the government is always talking about, not the government, that conservatives are always throwing around, they're really talking about the states not spending federal money the way the states agree to spend federal money when they take it. So all this bullshit about states' rights and, let the states spend the money how they want, they know damn well. Just like Reagan and his cronies knew damn well that states were not hiring poor people. They were not training poor people for new jobs. They were taking that federal money that was supposed to go to training poor people and giving them skills to get a permanent job. And they were balancing their budgets with that money. They were paying their existing employees, and they were leaving poor people in the lurch. That's why CETA had such a low number of participants, because the states were stealing the money and ripping off poor people. But what did Reagan do? He blamed poor people. So the elimination of the CETA program was one part of the perfect storm that contributed to the crack epidemic. Deinstitutionalization was another part of this perfect storm. Deinstitutionalization, Abdus and I talked about this all the time too, if you were paying any attention. Deinstitutionalization, is, you probably cannot see that very well. There you go. Deinstitutionalization is the policy of moving severely mentally ill people out of large federally funded state institutions and then closing that part or all of the federal institution and supposedly giving those people what do they call it, like community-based support, right? That was the idea. I just wanted to share that description, that definition with you, because I wasn't going to remember all that. Of course, that was the idea, but that is not how deinstitutionalization actually went. This is an amazing timeline of the impact of deinstitutionalization from Mother Jones. Abdus and I talked about what happened in our communities. He lived in Camden, New Jersey. I lived here in Southeast DC. What happened in our communities when all of a sudden, there were homeless people in our communities. And you could tell that a lot of those people had mental issues. Well, the reason that happened was because the federal government under President Carter, now, everybody always likes to point to Reagan as, the ultimate bad guy. No, Carter did some messed up things too, because deinstitutionalization was actually formalized under President Carter, even though the idea began in 1955. And like I said, this timeline in Mother Jones is great. Let's get down here to 1955. There's some really interesting and messed up stuff in here about the history of state mental institutions. Really disturbing. But in 1955, the number of mentally ill people in public psychiatric hospital was around 560,000. All right. That's more than 500,000 people. So you go down here to around 1963, and President Kennedy signs the Community Mental Health Act to provide federal funding for the construction of community-based preventative care and treatment facilities. But between the Vietnam War and the economic crisis, guess what didn't get funded? Community-based mental health. So it was never done. So we go down to 1977. This is when Jimmy Carter was in office. At this point, oh, my scrolly thing is, there we go. At this point in 1977, there are 650 community health facilities serving 1.9 million mentally ill patients a year. Now remember, in 1955, there was a little over 500,000 mentally ill patients in federal mental health institutions. By 1977, that number has more than doubled. And there clearly were not enough community health facilities to help all of those people. So Jimmy Carter in 1980 signed the Mental Health Systems Act, which was supposed to restructure the community mental health center program and improve services for people with chronic mental illnesses. That was the idea. But see, Carter did this in 1980. He didn't win re-election. Reagan won re-election, and under Reagan, he signed the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, which repealed Carter's community health legislation and established block grants for states, which ended the federal government's role in providing services to the mentally ill. What happened? Federal mental health spending decreased by 30%. All right. So let me go back up here. Do you see the difference in dates here? This is 3 years, 3 very pivotal, important years. And this is why I really have a problem with politicians who and people who push, the lame duck politician who's, not going to win re-election so that they're a lame duck, or they're at the end of their last term, so they're a lame duck. So they should just throw everything, in the kitchen sink into all of the, don't do that. This problem with the lack of sufficient services for mental health support in communities across this country was evident all throughout Carter's entire administration. He didn't do anything about it until 1980. That to me is inexcusable. It is just as inexcusable to me as John F. Kennedy signing the Community Mental Health Act, but then not funding it to build more community-based mental health services because the U.S. government threw all their money at the Vietnam War. Just as inexcusable. All right, so we'll go down here. 81, Reagan cuts the federal mental health budget by 30%. What happens on the streets? What does it look like? It looks like mental health institutions like, I can't remember the big one in Los Angeles, but Bellevue in New York City, St. Elizabeth's here in Washington, D.C., the one in Philadelphia and Camden, New Jersey, having to release nonviolent mental patients onto the streets during the day and hoping that they would come back at night or at some point for their medication, literally because they no longer had the federal funds to house and feed those people. That's what it looks like. That's what this policy looked like in our communities. So all of a sudden, we had a homeless problem that we did not have before. All of a sudden, businesses started to be affected by people who, through no fault of their own, could not function well in society. And they needed medication, they needed supervision, they needed to be in a safe environment where they could get the treatment and the support that they needed. But Reagan, ultimately, through several presidents, those community services were not adequately funded. Those people did not get the help they needed outside of federally funded institutions. And by the time Reagan came into office, he just took the money out of the federal institutions, and that's what happened. So look at this number here. Federal mental health spending decreased by 30%. By 1984, an Ohio-based study found that 30% of homeless people are thought to suffer from mental illnesses. You think? By 1985, that was the year I graduated high school, federal funding drops to only 11% of community mental health agency budgets. That's it. By 2004, studies suggest that about 16% of prisons and jail inmates are seriously mentally ill, and that was at the time roughly 320,000 people. This year, I forget which year this article was published in, but you'll see it when you read it. There are about 100,000 psychiatric beds in public and private hospitals. Only 100,000 psychiatric beds in the entire country in public and private hospitals. This means that there are more than 3 times as many seriously mentally ill people in jails and prisons than there are in hospitals. And let me scroll up real quick so I can see when this article was published. Oh, 2013. So you know this number is higher now. You know that there are more people who are struggling with mental illness in jails and prisons than there are hospitals, than there are in hospitals. By 2010, there are 43,000, down from 100,000 psychiatric beds in the United States, or about 14 beds for every 100,000 people. The same ratio as in 1850. So that was the second part of the perfect storm that created the crack epidemic. Here's the third part, and this is where the politics come in. This is where the serious politics behind addiction comes in. Because you have all of a sudden, at the same time all of that was happening, the CETA program eliminated, federally funded mental health services cut drastically to nothing. At the same time, the illicit drug market in the United States was flooded with cocaine that used to be expensive because it wasn't that plentiful in supply. But it was flooded. The market was flooded in the U.S. so much because, now then it became cheap. And that's where crack comes in. Because this is where the politics of crack come in. And of course, you add in the other issues that make up the disruptions to the U.S. economy, that article, that report from the National Academy's note, that paragraph before the one I read, pointed out, like the extraction of blue-collar jobs, and add that to the death rates that relate to persistent and continual racial discrimination and class oppression that the report notes in that paragraph. And that's the perfect storm. All of this is the perfect storm for our people that the crack epidemic emerged in the late 80s. All right, so let's get into some of those politics real quick. like I said, and those of you who are old enough to remember, cocaine used to be a rich person's drug until the market was flooded by all this cocaine, and all of a sudden it became really, really cheap. How did that happen? Why did that happen? Well, it happened during the Reagan administration, and yeah, this time he really is the devil in this one. And it happened because the Reagan administration made money off of the trafficking of cocaine, so that the war against the leftist Sandinista government in Nicaragua could be funded. Okay? So here's how that happened. Reagan, according to this great article from the Los Angeles Times, from their archives, this article is from February 1987. Reagan didn't get the approval from Congress that he wanted to give the Contras money. You know, the Contras were the right-wing militia force that the U.S. imperialist government and other imperialist countries propped up to fight the leftist Sandinista government in Nicaragua. Reagan goes to Congress, asks for money to fund the Contras. Congress said no, believe it or not. Congress said no this time. So what Reagan did was he relied on this clandestine operation that the CIA undertook to traffic cocaine and use that money to fund the Contras instead. And in this article here in the LA Times, so here is the proof. Reagan tried to get money from Congress for 2 years to aid the Contras in Nicaragua. And for 2 years, Congress said nope. Reagan also portrayed the Contras as penniless, and I actually remember this. They're poor peasant freedom fighters for democracy, fighting against the communists, insurgents that have taken over Nicaragua. Okay, yeah, and this was 87. I was 2 years out of high school. I didn't know what the hell communism was, but I knew that I didn't like Ronald Reagan, right? So I knew there was something real shady about some of the stuff he was saying. So here's some other information that I found out in this research that I think is fascinating. So Congress, like I said, for 2 years was like, nope, not giving you money. So there was this narrative that came around that private companies, private donations were funding the Contras because Congress wouldn't give them money. And the LA Times reported back then in 1987 that the money that the Contras received came from countries that were friendly to the United States, countries like Saudi Arabia, Israel, South Korea, Taiwan, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala. And why are these three countries important? Because they had already been the victims of U.S. imperialist intervention. They had leaders in their countries that were leaders or large factions in their countries that were friendly to the United States. So this was a secret aid program. All right. And the Reagan and the conservatives spun this narrative that the resistance, the plucky peasant resistance that is the Contras, has been kept alive because of private help. And who said this? Elliot Abrams. He said, some very, very brave people have been willing to actually bring this material, arms, weapons, as well as money, into Nicaragua. God bless them, because they were fighting for freedom in Central America. Abrams and other officials didn't mention at the time that the aid they described as private had come from foreign governments friendly to the United States and delivered with the help from the CIA and the staff of the NSC, the National Security Council. Now, it's interesting that this is a pretty major publication that that basically just explained imperialism without using the word imperialism right there. I thought that was just brilliant and hilarious. Here's another name that you will recognize. The official in charge of the secret program at the NSC was Oliver North, the same NSC aide who managed the arms sales to Iran. And according to testimony from administration officials, helped divert profits from that deal into supplies for the Contras. So you've got this government right now that is doing everything it can, aside from actually bombing Iran, to demonize Iran. When back in the 80s, they sold weapons to Iran so that they could make money to give to y'all. Whew. And the article points out that the Contra aid campaign was, of course, not a one-man operation. Evidence gathered by the Senate Intelligence Committee, along with the accounts of administration officials, indicates that Reagan was well aware of the effort, as were his national security advisors, McFarlane and John Poindexter, and the director of the CIA, William J. Casey, the George Washington University, that has this entire archive, the National Security Archive, about the Contras, cocaine, and covert operations. And they basically document the whole trove of evidence that proves that this was not a conspiracy theory. This was an actual conspiracy that the United States government was involved in. A conspiracy just means that, a bunch of people doing some stuff in secret that they ain't telling you about to do some other stuff. That's a conspiracy. But this isn't a theory. This is fact. And there is evidence of this. And it starts with the 1996 series that journalist Gary Webb wrote and published in the San Jose Mercury News in 1996. I urge you to check out a movie called Kill the Messenger if it's still on Netflix. That is the story of Gary Webb. If you watch the, I think it's FX series Snowfall, there is a Gary Webb character in that series. But this archive has not only, this information, but it's also got court testimony, naming Reagan administration officials, details about the Contra war effort, FBI and DEA reports corroborating, proving that CIA agents were involved in drug trafficking and taking the money and giving it to the NSC, and Oliver North knew about it, and Ronald Reagan knew about it, and the CIA chief knew about it, and the NSC knew about it. Yeah, all of this. So this is how cocaine went from being a rich white person's drug, mostly, because it wasn't in massive supply, to being so plentiful in the US that it was being cooked up with baking soda or worse, ammonia, and sold in rock form in our neighborhoods. Strangely enough, only in our neighborhoods now, or primarily in our neighborhoods, meaning Black, Chicano, indigenous neighborhoods, for like $5 to maybe $20 a hit. That's in a nutshell where crack came from. And it's never left our streets. So now let's talk about the science of addiction. Let's talk about crack. Let's talk about it in scientific medical terms, and let's not be emotional about it. Because crack is not a separate drug from powdered cocaine. And it is not, as many people believed, and me included, I used to believe this too, more addictive than powdered cocaine because it is crack. You understand? The issue with crack is how it is introduced into the body and the brain that is very different from how powdered cocaine is introduced into the body and the brain, and even heroin and opioids and alcohol for that matter. And that difference in introduction into the body and brain produces different results. So what does that mean? Here's an answer to this issue, this belief that we have that crack is more addictive than powdered cocaine simply because it is crack, that it's in a different form. Is crack more addictive than coke? We asked experts. I can't see the date for this article, but anyway, crack and cocaine are the same drug in different forms. All right. Is one more addictive than the other? According to Medicine Plus, the effects of smoking crack are instant and intense, and they can last up to 10 minutes. All right. The effects of snorting cocaine can start within 5 minutes and last up to 30 minutes, but less intense than smoking. The fast, short nature of crack highs may make it more addictive, but again, not because it is simply crack, but because of the way it is introduced into the body. Why? They explain. Crack is inhaled through the lungs and spreads through the body, producing the high much more quickly and lasts for a shorter time than snorting cocaine. This is what John Giordano, an addiction counselor and the founder of the National Institute for Holistic Addiction Studies, told WebMD. He said this causes a cycle of binging and crashing, which puts the user at risk of at a greater risk of dependence. So it is not that crack is more addictive because it is crack. Crack is more addictive because it is smoked. So that means that if you smoke powdered cocaine, the exact same thing happens. That means if you smoke heroin, the exact same thing happens. And I like to kind of think about it as think about if you have asthma, right? And you need an inhaler. And there's a reason that the medicine is delivered for asthma in an inhaler, because the medicine is delivered to your bloodstream to get to your lungs faster because it is inhaled. All right? That is the difference between powdered cocaine and crack cocaine, and why addiction to crack cocaine looks different and the behavior looks different than the addiction and the behavior from people who are struggling with addiction to powdered cocaine. First of all, again, powdered cocaine is still expensive. Powder cocaine is still way more expensive than crack. It is. And also, you're talking about a massive, instant euphoric high from smoking cocaine that is very, very short. That is incredibly important when you understand how that affects the brain. I'll get to that in a minute. But like I said, they go on to explain that smoking or injecting cocaine. So if you inject powdered cocaine or heroin, same thing happens. Causes it to enter the bloodstream and reach the brain faster than snorting it and rubbing it into your gums. The faster a drug gets to the brain, the more reinforcing and addictive it is. Not because it's crack, but because it just gets to your bloodstream and your brain faster. And this is where he says, this is what the doctor said, not Jackie. If you smoke or inject powdered cocaine, it's just as addictive as smoking crack. All right. So let's disabuse ourselves with this idea that crack itself is more addictive because it's crack. No, it's not. So you understand why the sentencing disparities are absolute racist bullshit now, right? You get that now, right? And politicians have always known this. Yes, I do sometimes read scientific journals. This is from the U.S. National Library of Medicine, National Institutes of Health. This is dated 2005. And this is called The Neurobiology of Cocaine Addiction. Scroll down, I highlighted a lot in here, but this right here blew my mind. The very first sentence of the article, 20 years ago, science identified the specific brain mechanisms that underlie the cocaine high. This was published in 2005. 20 years ago would have been, what year would that have been? 1985. Is my math right? What was going on during the 80s? The crack epidemic. And everybody knew that crack was nothing more than cocaine that was in a different form. But during that time, scientists knew that specific brain functions contributed to the cocaine high. So, a bunch of questions I asked in here. One of the most important questions, excuse me, that people ask about people who struggle with substance abuse disorder, especially in relation to crack, is, how do people keep taking the drug? How do people keep using when they know it might cost them their jobs, their possessions, their loved ones, their freedoms, and maybe even their lives? Why do people with every intention not to use find it so hard to get away from the drug? Why do they find it so hard not to use? And why do they remain vulnerable to relapse after years of abstinence? Again, y'all, this article was written in 2005. It's 2021, and we're still running around calling people crackheads and writing them off because we just look at them and say, well, they just trifling because they just don't want to stop using. It's not that simple, because cocaine affects the brain cells in a variety of ways. Some of the effects go back to normal very quickly. Others last for weeks after the drugs leave the brain. You know what that is? The clinical term for that is brain damage. The changes to your brain that last and that don't go back, and your brain doesn't go back to normal, that is brain damage. And that is what cocaine does to your brain in any form. So does heroin, so does meth, so do opioids, and so does alcohol if you abuse it for long enough. But again, if you're not smoking those powdered forms of drugs, then it takes a little bit longer for the damage to occur. But the brain damage for people who struggle with crack addiction, it's almost instant in some areas of their brain. So then with repeated exposure to cocaine, the short and immediate effects cumulatively lead to more effects, more brain damage that lasts for months or maybe years and might be irreversible. All right, so they talk about alterations in genetic activity that last for weeks, alterations in nerve cell structure that last for months and possibly longer. But here is why the immediate high that happens when people smoke crack or powdered cocaine or heroin or inject it leads to brain damage, because whether it's snorted, smoked, or injected, cocaine enters the bloodstream rapidly, all that kind of stuff. So what happens is the drug causes a high, and the high is a result of a buildup of dopamine, right? And this is the sciencey stuff that I can't entirely explain in a really clear way. But basically, what we're talking about with smoking any of these powdered forms of drugs is that the immediate effect on the brain is this euphoric, instant, incredibly intense high, because the brain is literally flooded with the chemical dopamine. And that's really important because dopamine is supposed to be regulated in your brain, and dopamine is pretty much how we know that we like things, that things are pleasurable, right? When a thirsty person drinks or someone has an orgasm, dopaminergic, there we go, cells flood the area of the brain with the dopamine molecules. The receiving cell's response makes us feel good and want to repeat the activity and re-experience that pleasure. But by artificially causing a buildup of dopamine in that area of the brain, cocaine creates these enormously powerful feelings of pleasure. And this amount of dopamine, as the very smart scientists explain, can exceed the amounts associated with natural activities. All right? And this area of the brain, by the way, is called the limbic system. But that's not the only way that the brain is damaged. The limbic system also includes memory centers located in the hippocampus and the amygdala. So these areas in our brain in the limbic system help us remember what we did that lead to things that we like. Scientists believe that repeated cocaine exposure with its associated dopamine jolts alters the cells in the brain in ways that eventually convert conscious memory and desire into a near compulsion to respond to cues by seeking and taking the drug. And then there's a third part of the brain, the frontal cortex, that acts as a brake on the other parts of the limbic system when we decide to not, pursue something. That is a chemical process that's governed by the frontal cortex that helps us avoid negative consequences. In non-addicted people, it really is that simple. We don't think about it, but it's all a part of a chemical process in our brain. But for people who suffer with substance disorder, continued cocaine abuse actually suppresses that part of the brain, so that once somebody becomes addicted, the frontal cortex becomes impaired. What does that word mean? It means brain damage. And those decisions that those chemical processes make that help us avoid negative consequences, they're not made because those neural pathways are damaged. Now, there's another part in here about genes and the effect of cocaine on the expression of genes. I love that they say that the idea that our genes never change, that's not true. This is a really a really important piece that I swear I cannot really explain this. But they explain the molecular chemical transition between drug abuse, like using a drug too much just because you like it, and addiction. And they make a distinction because apparently there is a chemical distinction and there is a switch that makes that transition in the brain. And it's fascinating. I did not know that. There's a nice little graphic here. I don't know what any of it means, but it's very scientific, and it is clinical scientific evidence that addiction is not just people out here being shitty, not caring about other people. It is literally people acting in ways that result from literal brain damage that they did not know would happen to them. That is a key part of this. Nobody who's out here struggling with addiction, losing everything, losing their family, losing their home, losing their job. None of those people are out there struggling with this, selling their body to get money for the next hit, stealing to get money for the next hit, lying to family and friends, causing all of this pain. None of those people are out there because they want to be. People who struggle with substance abuse disorder are not making the decisions to use because they actually like using. They are using because they are literally unable to stop. Abdus would say frequently when we would have conversations about his struggles, don't you think that if I wanted to stop, don't you think that if I could stop, that I would? I want to stop. And he has had periods of sobriety. But he couldn't, as they say in the 12-step programs, stay stopped. And we're going to talk about the 12-step programs in a minute. But let me get through the rest of this stuff. Because, yeah, we are at the point where we're going to talk about treatment. Because, you know, people have mentioned AA and Al-Anon and 12-step programs and rehab and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, let's talk about that. But I just really want to emphasize that people who are out here doing horribly destructive things to themselves and to people who love them and who they love, because they are chasing a drug, they're chasing an addiction, they're not doing it because they don't love you. They're not doing it because they don't love themselves. They're not doing it because they are antisocial or because they're trifling or because, you know, they're fuck ups, or they're not doing it because they want to. They are doing it because their brains have been changed. They have brain damage and they cannot stop. That's why they're doing it. That's why the behavior looks the way it does. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that there are not people who, you know, use drugs and abuse them because they like it. Of course there are. Of course there are. But our you know, people who have lost everything, family, home, jobs, their health, and know that they could lose their life if they don't stop, but they keep using, they're not doing that because they want to. Come on. The science proves that they're acting that way because their brain has been damaged, so they cannot control their actions. So, all right, let's talk about treatment, because many people have said, well, look, you know, you need to get into a treatment program. And I'm sure you're asking, what treatment options are there for crack addiction in particular? Okay. And we're going back to politics and policy because, look, that's it. It's what it is. This is from the nice people at the Drug Policy Alliance. What options are available to treat cocaine addiction? There are no approved medications to treat cocaine addiction, but there are behavioral therapies and self-help groups that can be effective. Unfortunately, not enough resources have been devoted to developing specialized approaches or evaluating their efficacy. Y'all see this shit? Now, you want to sit there and you want to keep telling me that all people need to do is go to treatment? It's not that simple, because there is not sufficient treatment available that is effective and adequate and specialized for cocaine addiction, any form of cocaine addiction. Okay, that's one. And about medication, let me a little aside. Medication for opioid treatment is hard to get a prescription for. There is medication for opioid treatment, but it is hard to get treatment for or to get a prescription for. And that medication is called, let me see if I can get it right. Here we go. Oh, wait a minute. Let me, I don't know. Look, I want to make sure you can see this. Why is this live chat thing here? It's annoying. All right. There we go. Now you can see the headline. Is this my, yeah, this is my favorite common man's medical source again. WebMD, addiction treatment is denied for many, a study finds. This was from 2019, June 2019. And this is just for people who are addicted to opioids. But when people who are addicted to opioids decide to quit, they're usually denied treatment. And the treatment that could be most effective for them is a medication called buprenorphine. Buprenorphine, all right? And that helps people to stop using opioids. But they did this little secret shopper study that suggested that most people who struggle with opioid addiction, who are looking for a prescription for this medication that will help them stop using, they have trouble getting an appointment with a doctor that's qualified to dispense the drug. And that's just for opioid, people who struggle with opioid addiction, right? Let me go, hold on. There were some statistics here that, when researchers called doctors' offices as addicts who wanted to get a prescription for buprenorphine so they could stop using heroin, 46% of those who said they had Medicaid were denied an appointment, while 38% of those who said they would pay in cash were turned away. And that's for people who are struggling with opioid addiction. What do you think happens to people who are struggling with crack addiction, who are mostly Black? What do you think happens? I'll tell you what happens. So for us, when we talked a little bit earlier about state-run mental health institutions, one of the services that was provided by a lot of those state-run institutions was drug rehab. So I know a lot of people who are older than me who were able to kick heroin and, other drugs, alcohol, by checking themselves into St. Elizabeth's and going to the drug treatment program. Now, I mean, okay, the treatments weren't great, right? They would not be used today. They wouldn't use Thorazine today. They wouldn't, lock people who are suffering from substance abuse disorder in a padded cell in a straitjacket. And I know this sounds weird, but people who wanted help had somewhere to go to get help to detox and kick their drug habit. But remember what we said happened to the funding for federally funded mental health institutions. It is practically non-existent. And those programs are pretty much non-existent as far as any practical, for all intents and purposes, because the number of open spaces in state run rehab programs does not come anywhere close to meeting the demand that reflects the number of people who need and want treatment. There's a waiting list to get into a lot of state treatment detox programs. And for people who struggle with crack addiction, and I learned this from Abdul Shahid, there was a time when crack addicts would not be admitted into state rehab facilities because at some point, these people said that crack wasn't an addiction that had a physical component. So you had a bunch of people who were struggling with crack addiction who wanted to get clean, but who had to go out and get falling down drunk, or who had to snort cocaine or shoot up heroin. Actually, no, not snort cocaine, because it was, they said that cocaine in itself was not didn't have a physical aspect to the addiction. So they would have to get drunk, falling down drunk, and or they would have to shoot up heroin in order for people who were addicted to crack to get admitted into some state rehab facilities. Who do you think most of those people were? Most of those people were our people. So, okay. That was one of these stories that Abdus shared with me about his struggles that I know he wanted to share with you. So let's pump the brakes on everybody just needs to go to rehab. Plenty of our people wanted to go to rehab, wanted to get help, wanted to get clean, and they were turned away. All right. But what about rehab? What about rehab? We live in a capitalist society, and healthcare is basically privatized and for profit in this country. Is the rehab model in the U.S. like that? Hell yeah, it's like that. It's actually worse. This is an article that was the beginning of a series that was started in Vox magazine in 2019. And as far as I can tell, they have not done a follow-up. And this is an incredible, incredible article about how the rehab model in this country it's not broken. It's just a for-profit system, just like every other aspect of healthcare. So this idea that everybody can just go to rehab, no, everybody cannot just go to rehab. Why? So I think it's worth noting that this article is about, nice white people up in Vermont. Okay. And I think that sometimes I feel like that's the only time people will actually listen to the problems that affect oppressed people is when the same shit happens to white people. Okay. But anyway, I didn't write the article. The nice people at Vox did. Highlighted some stuff. The writer of the article said that in story after story, and the person who is the member of the family who's at the center of this article was addicted to opioids, and he died of an overdose. There were more than 70,000 people who died of drug overdoses in 2017 alone. Families were desperate to avoid that. And so are people who are struggling with the addiction. They don't want to be struggling. They don't want to be addicted. So this author spoke with a lot of families who had the same stories. Each of the families that they spoke to spent tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars on addiction treatment. Each of the families this author spoke to spent tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars on addiction treatment. Y'all, we sitting here, a bunch of oppressed people who don't have that kind of money. We don't have that kind of money for quote unquote luxuries. A lot of us are struggling to pay our rent, our bills, our mortgage. We don't have any extra to go to rehab for people that we love and that we want to help. So in story after story, the same experience was repeated over and over. Patients and families getting stuck in the American rehab industry that is unregulated, ineffective, and expensive. I'm going to scroll on down. Here's the thing about rehab, and particularly 12-step programs, that I want people to understand. I have nothing against 12-step programs. Alcoholics Anonymous, for alcohol addiction. And the rate of effectiveness for Alcohol Anonymous is better for people who struggle with alcohol addiction because of the way alcohol is delivered into the body and affects the brain, right? The reason 12-step programs are not as effective for narcotics is because of the brain damage that narcotics creates in the brain. There is nothing in the 12-step program that addresses the chemical changes in the brain. Nothing. That is why the 12-step programs are not as effective for addictions outside of alcohol treatment. The author makes that point right here. And unfortunately, the American rehab model is dominated by the 12-step approach. All right. Again, I am not bashing the 12-step approach. I know plenty of people who have been in the rooms. Abdus and I we were in the rooms for a while, and plenty of people find comfort, support, and help, and some do find success and sobriety in the rooms, and that's fabulous. But most of those people are struggling with alcohol addiction, and most people who struggle with narcotics addiction, any addiction outside of alcohol, find less and less efficacy in the 12-step program. Those are just the facts. Again, I'm not bashing the 12-step program, just saying it's not effective for addiction that is not alcohol. And it's not incredibly effective for alcohol addiction. But those are the facts. I don't want to get too much into that. And I think somebody mentioned Al-Anon in the chat. I personally am not crazy about Al-Anon, because I went to plenty of Al-Anon meetings, and what I heard was people just reciting dogma over and over again, and dogma don't help my pain as someone who loves someone who's struggling with this disorder that they don't even understand why they can't overcome. Right? So, okay, that's all I'm gonna say on the 12-step program, because I got to finish this up and I don't want people coming after me. Let's see. This guy, Sean, went to rehab more than a dozen times in facilities that were well-intentioned, but they were overwhelmed and they were ineffective. He didn't get medications for his opioid addiction, and he didn't get treatment or medication for his bipolar disorder that went undiagnosed and untreated until later in his life. Sound familiar? And then people go to treatment, which is usually 30 days, maybe 60 days, maybe 90 days if you have really great insurance or you just have all that money, and they don't have the kind of follow-up intensive follow-up that they really need. Let me scroll down. And this is a quote from this young man, Sean, who died. He wrote this to his mom. He said, "I love being sober. It's life that gets in the way." And here's what I want you to understand about people who are struggling with addiction and bipolar disorder. But let's just deal with the addiction. Because of the brain damage that occurs, especially in narcotics addiction. People who achieve some time of sobriety, it doesn't matter how short the time is, doesn't matter how long, they really do enjoy being sober. They're glad they're sober. They're thankful that they're sober. Here's the problem. Life is stressful. You and I know life is stressful. Life's stressful for me. Life was stressful for me when I was 15. You remember the story I told you about our experience with Darnell? Because of the politics and the policies that are imposed upon our communities, life is stressful for us. Incredibly stressful. Imagine having to deal with this incredibly stressful life without the veil of some substance that numbs your feelings to this incredibly stressful life. You're great that you're grateful that you are sober, but then if you're like Jacquie Luqman was, you understood the politics and you couldn't ignore it, and you couldn't not be angry at it, you could not be frustrated at it. So that's a level of stress. And then you have a job that you're probably not being treated fairly on. That's a level of stress. Then you got all these other issues, child support enforcement. You got family that treats you like shit. You got this, this self-esteem, self-image problem that was created by people generally not treating you like shit. And then on top of that, you've got an untreated mental disorder, bipolar disorder. That's stress, y'all. And then you've got brain damage from the exposure to your brain from the narcotics. Once you understand all of this, once you have all of this information, how are people still sitting there talking about all people who are addicts need to do is? There is no all. It's not that simple. And you and I, who have not suffered brain damage because of exposure to narcotics, we can do, sit here and make the decision to, I need to do self-care. I need to unplug, or some of us will do things like, look, you enjoy a glass of wine to relax. Good on you. That's fine. I do. But then you got some people who smoke a little weed or take a few mushrooms or do a little bit of microdosing or whatever. And they see that that's fine. But then some of those same people who indulge in those things, who I have no judgment against, I seriously do not, except for when those very same people turn around and shit on people who are addicted to crack and talk about, well, if they wanted to stop, all they had to do was they made their choice. They chose this. They should do. So health insurance, this family had health insurance. They have the same health insurance I have, Blue Cross and Blue Shield, Care First. They agreed to pay around $28,000. The insurance company did. That's how expensive. And honestly, that's like low for a lot of rehab centers. Excuse me. The Blake family were left with about $8,000 after insurance paid that $28,000. Insurance didn't always pay for care. They had to appeal a bunch of times. When the insurance did pay, the Blakes had to come up with the $5,000 deductible and the 20% co-insurance. Yeah. $10,000 that we ended up that we were left to pay after insurance didn't cover everything for Abdus going to rehab. I told you I was going to be honest because he was going to be honest about it. And I'm not going to sit here and spend all this time sharing all these links, telling you all this stuff without being honest about my own personal experience, our own personal experience, and how I know this shit is true. I know it's true because I live it. We lived it. All right. So, and as far as insurance is concerned, Abdus told me when he went to rehab, there were a couple of times when the rehab center would kick people out who were terrified of leaving because they knew they were not ready because their insurance wouldn't pay for any more time. How fucked up is that? And what happened? Those people left. They relapsed. Some of those people OD'd and died. Yeah. So the rehab racket in the United States is a racket. It's a fucking scam. It absolutely is. It doesn't really provide real help to people, clinical help, medical help to address substance abuse disorder on its own. It really doesn't. And then if people have a co-concurring mental health disorder, then rehab doesn't provide diagnosis, treatment, and support for that at the same time without charging you some extra money. People who go into some rehabs some rehabs do offer medically assisted treatment. But if you choose medically assisted treatment, they charge you more money and the insurance doesn't cover it. I'm telling you what I know. So addiction treatment basically creates this vicious cycle. People are desperate for some help, a cure, treatment. They get into the first addiction treatment they can because there are so few, and especially there are even fewer for poor people. And if people have a little bit of money, they pay whatever's necessary because when you love, I just want you healthy. I just want you whole. Okay, fine. We'll pay it. Not really intending to pay all that money back. But then the treatment doesn't stick, or there's no serious follow-up. Why doesn't the treatment stick? Because it's based on a 12-step model that is not based on the clinical medical realities of substance abuse disorder. That's why it doesn't stick. So when people are looking for treatment, there's no way for people to know if a treatment is good. I mean, there's not like a Yelp board for rehab. There probably should be, but there isn't. And Medicaid and Medicare Services says that they have over 4,000 quality measures for Medicaid and Medicare services in general. Over 4,000 quality measures. There are no quality measures for addiction programs in this country. None. So they can basically do and say anything they want, take the insurance company's money, take your money. And that's basically what they do. Not all of them, but far, far too many of them. This is, let me read this and I'm going to move on. John Kelly, an addiction treatment expert at Harvard University, said that treatment can take several times over several years to stick. What's unclear is if this is mostly an inherent problem with drug use disorders, which are, after all, chronic relapsing conditions, or because they're caused by America's fucked up addiction treatment system, which frequently rejects proven medications for opioid addiction and treatment. John Kelly says the problem in the industry isn't that we have a few bad actors. He said, Mark, a health economist, said, it's that a large portion of the addiction industry is not providing the type of care that we know leads to recovery. Oh, there's some more stuff about 12 steps and why it doesn't work for people who are not struggling with alcohol addiction. Take that however you want. There are some medications that are suggested or that are being used to see how they treat narcotics addiction. Buprenorphine, methadone, we all know about methadone, and naltrexone, which I had not heard of before. The jury's out on how effective they are, but they exist. There's something. But here's an interesting thing, that a lot of people who struggle with addiction, because of the way we are indoctrinated about addiction and shaming people, and a lot of people who struggle with addiction, if they are offered a drug to help them overcome their addiction, or at least prevent and avoid relapse, a lot of people will refuse the drugs. Why is that? The treatment drugs. Why is that? Aside from a lot of treatment centers just not offering any of these drugs, treatment centers discourage sometimes using them based on this moralizing, stigmatizing view that using medication is replacing one drug with another. And a lot of people who struggle with substance abuse disorder think the same thing. We're all indoctrinated by the same system. So it's this just whole evil ecosystem that was completely manufactured by this government, that made economic conditions so shitty that some people intentionally want to escape the hellscape of their realities. But some people, look, we all are young, we all party, we all try stuff, and tried something that they had no idea that they would become addicted to and that would cause brain damage. And they are made to feel so ashamed that they are drug users, that they're druggies, that they won't take medical help, medications that may help them kick the drugs they're addicted to. It is, yeah. John Brooklyn, an addiction doctor at Vermont's Howard Center, said that the stigma against medications perpetuated by treatment programs and 12-step meetings and us folks in society make it harder for Sean, the guy who was the subject of this story, and his family and other people who are struggling with addiction to accept treatments that could have helped. Let me see. I think I highlighted, we talked about treatment centers not diagnosing and treating mental disorders, mental illness disorders. And I talked last week about how if Abdus had gotten treatment, if he had been diagnosed, if his bipolar disorder had been diagnosed, and if he had gotten treatment years ago, then a lot of his struggles with relapse might have been avoided. I'm not saying he may never have avoided, because again, substance abuse disorder is a chronic illness because it's the result of brain damage. But a lot of the struggles that he had about the way he felt about himself, and some of the relapses and some of the situations he found himself in because of the relapses. If he had gotten treatment, diagnosed and treatment for the bipolar disorder, which made it harder for him not to relapse. It's hard enough not to relapse all by itself with substance abuse disorder. Maybe some of his struggles would have been mitigated. Let's see, what else did chronic relapsing condition. Okay, so that's the end of that. Whew. I know this is a lot. This is a lot for me, but I got to tell you, I am feeling like several boulders are being lifted off my shoulders. And I honestly hope, and off my heart, honestly, because I hope to God that this is helpful to you. By the way, if you want to know who John Kelly is, who was quoted in the article, he's this dude. You can find him on YouTube. And, I'm not sharing the audio. I'm just showing you that he has talked about treating addiction as a chronic disease as recently as 2019, because it is. So if you want to check him out and get more information from him, you can. I will provide the link for you. So I've gone through all that. Now I want to talk about fentanyl real quick, because fentanyl is the thing that has been added to this entire issue of substance abuse disorder, the political forces behind the crack epidemic that created the perfect storm that gave rise to it, that our people are still suffering from in our community. The completely fucked up and inadequate profit-driven rehab industry that people need to stop believing is easy for people to get into and actually solves people's problems, because it doesn't. There's a reason so many people are still addicted to all kinds of substances. You add fentanyl to this mix, and fentanyl is horrifying. It is absolutely horrifying. Something about fentanyl. There's some things about fentanyl we need to understand. Just like all of this. Oh, okay, that's not the one I want to share right now. Oh, wait, yes, it is, because there is a graphic in here that explains why fentanyl is so horrifying. One of the things that my sweetheart said to me, and this is an article, a very long, very good article, very sad and enraging article that in the Washington Post about fentanyl affecting heroin users, Black heroin users who are older here in DC, who are dying at epidemic rates because heroin began to be cut with fentanyl, and so did crack. But in this article, they focused on heroin users. But again, people leave out people who are struggling with crack addiction because of the stigma that people still have and still place on people who struggle with crack addiction. It's fucking maddening. But anyway, this article was published in 2018. So this is not like it was that long ago. Let me scroll down here to when they talk about prescription opiates and the surge in heroin use and opioid addiction surging in rural America, and how the drug overdose rates among Black people climbed by 12.1%, and how it rose even higher by 94%, more than double the 44.6% increase for white people. That rise in deaths have disproportionately happened in cities among Black people and other densely populated areas. Among 7 in 10 Black folks who died of a drug overdose in 2017, live in counties classified as heavily urban in the National Center for Health Statistics, compared with 3 in 10 whites. So they talk about how the opioid epidemic has changed, and what changed it? It's fentanyl. Fentanyl, and I highlighted this because this is where U.S. journalistic imperialism comes from, and the yellow journalism and the xenophobia. They leave out a lot of context and a whole timeline about the emergence of fentanyl in this country by going, straight to, but China was manufacturing fentanyl and importing it to Mexico by 2014. Let me give you the actual timeline of the emergence of fentanyl, why it's important. This timeline is extremely important because it's not China's fault. China didn't give us fentanyl. The U.S. pharmaceutical companies did. 1963, fentanyl was introduced across various Western European countries, where it was combined with other medications and used as an intravenous painkiller. By the 70s and early 80s, the drug was being used within cardiac and vascular surgery. It went off patent in 81. The sales increased in the U.S. tenfold. In the late 80s, a California company called Alza Corporation began to work on a transdermal drug delivery patch containing fentanyl. The patch, called Duragesic, was approved for patients with chronic pain who had become tolerant to other opiates. Another company began working on an oral delivery method for fentanyl. It was a lollipop called Actic that was approved in 1998. Now, look, the transdermal patch was already approved. Why did anybody need a lollipop? Well, this other company said they need a lollipop. So their little fentanyl lollipop was approved in 1988. It was indicated, they said, for cancer patients who were receiving and have become tolerant to around-the-clock opioid therapy for their cancer pain. But explain to me why the transdermal patch wasn't sufficient. Nobody can explain why, other than capitalism. So many other products were subsequently approved, including an effervescent lozenge, a sublingual tablet that you put under your tongue, and a buccal spray that you spray in your nose, all fentanyl based. No need for any of this other stuff, except to find other ways to make money off of fentanyl and different ways to deliver it. That's it. The most recent addition to the list is Onsolus, a film that dissolves in the mouth, and that was approved for cancer patients for pain in 2015. The FDA started to investigate Duragesic, noting that some doctors were inappropriately prescribing the patch. The Actic lollipop was being prescribed off-label. Between June 2005 and October 2006, more than 80% of patients who used the Actic fentanyl lollipop didn't actually have cancer. So whose fault is that? The people who were addicted, or the doctors who were prescribing the drug to people who knew damn well they didn't have cancer? There was also an uptick in reports of illicit recreational use because, see, now the doctors were making money too. Okay. By 2005 and 2007, the DEA identified over 1,000 deaths associated with illegally manufactured non-pharmaceutical fentanyl. There were several seizures of illicit fentanyl, including a raid on a lab that was manufacturing counterfeit OxyContin. This was not in China in 2007. This was in the United States. All right. 2013, street use of fentanyl began to climb, particularly in northeastern states, spread to Ohio, Florida, other parts of US and Canada. Then they talk about in 2013, some of the drug supply came from Mexico and was brought into North America by traffickers, with most of the rest originating in China. So when the Washington Post has this very short comment in their article about, China's manufacturing fentanyl in 2014, and that's the reason the fentanyl crisis grew so big. No, they leave out the entire timeline of the involvement of not just the pharmaceutical industry, but the United States government, the FDA, that approved all of these additional delivery methods for a drug that I think the graphic is in this article. Let me see. Is it here? Is it in here? Yes. All of those different delivery methods, that all of these different pharmaceutical methods got approved by the FDA for the same kind of treatment. People who were suffering from chronic pain, who had become immune, who couldn't, who had become immune. I guess that's the word that my word is escaping me, but for whom traditional pain medications or the existing pain medications were no longer working. So the fentanyl patch was already approved. You just stick it on your skin and the fentanyl is delivered. But all these other companies got all of these other delivery methods approved. And this is why this is so terrifying, that the FDA approved all these different methods and people are still blaming addicts, but not pointing the finger at the FDA. We've caught on that it's the pharmaceutical companies, but we still ain't pointing to the government. How potent is fentanyl compared to other opioids? Your common stuff that you take over the counter. There we go. So you can really see this. Ibuprofen, aspirin, acetaminophen. Ibuprofen, by the way, which you shouldn't take a whole lot of because it damages your kidneys. Aspirin, acetaminophen, that's your common stuff that's over the counter. Fentanyl is 50 to 100 times stronger than those. Excuse me. Fentanyl is 1 time stronger than hydrocodone. It is 3.5 times stronger than methadone. It is 2.5 to 5 times stronger than heroin. So you have a situation on the streets, and you've had this situation on the streets for a while, where heroin has been cut with fentanyl. And what this article does not point out, that crack has also begun to be cooked with fentanyl. And that is leading to a rise in overdose deaths of people who are not just addicted to heroin, long-term users of heroin who, if they didn't get hold of fentanyl-laced heroin would still be alive. But the same thing is happening to people who struggle with addiction to crack. What does this mean for our people, the actual people suffering from addiction? It means that we have been indoctrinated to leave our people to die in this system, on the streets, in shame, in fear, in embarrassment, alone, believing that they are awful people, that they are evil, and we're leaving them to the system that created all of the conditions that contributed to the struggles they're having. So to my eternal sorrow, this is part of my honey's story. It is. It is part of my story. It's part of our story. He worked so hard not to be ashamed of his past, and he was getting there. He was trying, but he couldn't do it. He never would have been able to do it without all the tools that he needed that he did not have and he never got, no matter how much I loved him. So if he had survived the last relapse, and Abdus did relapse about a week before he died, he and I would be doing this show together. We may not have been doing it on this date, but we would have eventually been doing this show together. I know this for a fact because so much of this information came from him, from conversations we had together. We had planned to do this. We had talked about it. So right now, I'm just finishing the work that we started. And understand, I have no shame in my husband or for him. And I never will, and I never did. Because I always knew that Abdus was more than his struggles, even though neither one of us really understood those struggles. But I always knew that he was so much more than his struggles. And every one of our people who's struggling with either substance abuse disorder or mental health disorders or both together, every one of our people struggling exactly the way Abdus did, they are all more than their struggles. So look, tonight I was just finishing the work that we started, and I was standing up for my husband, and I was trying to stand up for our people in the way that I know that he would have wanted us to do. But I will never really be finished with the work we started. Because like I said before, Luqman Nation forever. Thank you all very much for watching. I really, really appreciate you. And Abdus appreciated you so much. Y'all be really good to each other. Be really good to yourselves. Take care of each other. Peace.